Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown, Langley, British Columbia, by way of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia.
I am Matthew Stockton, Vancouver, British Columbia, by way of...
pretty much every city on the planet.
By way of Moscow, Frankfurt, London.
And the other London.
And the other London.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
In this episode, we look into the life and mysterious murder of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash, a prominent Indigenous activist whose story continues to haunt the corridors of justice and activism alike. Her journey took her from small-town Nova Scotia to the heart of the American Indian movement, AIM, in the United States during the tumultuous 1970s, where she fought for Indigenous rights. The mystery surrounding Annie Mae's death is as compelling as her life. In December 1975, she disappeared and was later found deceased on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Initial reports misleadingly attributed her death to exposure, but a second autopsy revealed she had been executed with a bullet to the back of her head. This revelation raised questions about who could have orchestrated such a brutal act against someone so profoundly committed to her cause, and it took over 30 years before the shocking truth was uncovered and the people responsible for Annie's murder were brought to justice. This is Dark Poutine episode 346, Complex Justice, the tragic story of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash. On March 27, 1945, Annie Mae Pictou was born to Mary Ellen Pictou and Francis Thomas Levi, both of Mi'kmaq descent, in the small community of Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, her father left the family before she was born, leaving her mother to raise Annie Mae and her siblings under challenging circumstances. Mary Ellen Pictou had only a third-grade education and struggled to provide for her children, resulting in a childhood marked by poverty and instability. My good friend Malcolm grew up in Shubenacadie, and it was part of my childhood. I traveled there several times to visit the Shubenacadie Wildlife Park, which has been in operation since 1954. I usually went there on a school trip. The park offers a range of outdoor recreational and educational opportunities, and it's home to over 50 species of mammals and birds, many native to Nova Scotia. Visitors can observe moose, black bears, cougars, and bald eagles in enclosures that mimic their natural habitats. The park also houses non-native species, including red deer and Patagonian maras. A notable resident is Shubenacadie Sam, a groundhog known for his annual Groundhog Day predictions due to Nova Scotia's Atlantic time zone. Sam is the first groundhog in North America to make a prediction each year.
Oh, look at that. Flexing his Atlantic time zone clout. Beating every other groundhog to the punch.
Yeah, exactly, by an hour.
Do you think he's over it by now? Like, he's just like obsessing about shadows since the 18th century?
I'm wondering how many Shubenacadie Sams there've been.
Probably one every year.
Probably. Oh, he kicked the bucket again.
Shubenacadie kicked the brackety.
Okay, yeah.
Shut up.
So even though we were there on school trips and the place has an Indigenous name, we weren't taught anything about Shubenacadie, at least in my day. Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia holds a deep historical significance as a region shaped by its Indigenous heritage. Long before European settlers arrived, the Mi'kmaq people inhabited the area relying on its abundant natural resources. The name Shubenacadie is derived from the Mi'kmaq language, meaning place of the ground nut, a reference to the edible tubers that grow in the region. The Shubenacadie River, which flows through the area, served as a vital transportation and trade route for the Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous communities, connecting them to a network of waterways across what is now the Maritime Provinces. The arrival of European settlers in the 17th century marked the beginning of profound and often devastating changes for the Mi'kmaq. The imposition of colonial policies aimed at assimilating Indigenous peoples culminated in the establishment of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School in 1930. This institution, part of Canada's broader residential school system, operated until 1967 and sought to eradicate Indigenous culture and language under the guise of education. Children from the Mi'kmaq and other First Nations communities were forcibly removed from their families and subjected to harsh discipline, isolation, and abuse within the school's walls. Many lost their connection to their culture, and the intergenerational trauma caused by this institution continues to impact survivors and their descendants. Today, the legacy of the Shubenacadie Residential School is remembered as a painful chapter in Canadian history. Efforts to heal and reconcile are ongoing, with the Mi'kmaq community working to reclaim their heritage and preserve their cultural identity. Shubenacadie stands as a reminder of the resilience of Indigenous peoples and the necessity of acknowledging and addressing historical injustices. According to the National Film Board documentary, The Spirit of Annie Mae, she, her two sisters, and her younger brother were raised in the traditions of their Indigenous heritage. Annie Mae's childhood was deeply connected to nature and community values. Their early years were spent in a wigwam surrounded by vast woods where she and her siblings played freely, immersed in the natural world. When asked by outsiders about their origins, Annie's surviving siblings continue to emphasize pride in their upbringing, distinguishing it from the hardships associated with reservations, which they refer to as, quote, government concentration camps. Instead, they credit their parents for raising them with care and dignity, instilling a sense of belonging and respect for their culture. The family's early home was modest, a one-room camp constructed of wood and tar paper with an earthen floor and a small pot-belly stove for warmth. Despite the simplicity of their surroundings, they never felt poor. Their life was rich with adventure and connection, marked by carefree days of exploration. Annie's siblings recall her daring antics, such as clinging to the backs of cows as they sprinted across fields, or riding pigs that playfully bounced her against the barn porch. These moments of unrestrained joy capture the freedom and innocence of their childhood.
Okay, so Mike?
Yes.
I used to ride pigs as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
So my aunt would herd them.
Mm-hmm.
My brother and I would stand on the fence and jump onto them when we were really small, and the contest was see who could stay on the back of a pig the longest.
Yeah, that sounds like A whole bunch of fun that probably my parents wouldn't have let us do.
Well, you just, you'd fall into the pig pen. And my aunt, who's a listener, and she's in the embryo yard, we just spray down with the hose before we went home.
Of course.
Before I went back to the grandma's house, right?
So was it stuff that your parents knew you were doing, or...
Well, you know what it was like in the 70s. We spent so much of our time hanging out on the farm, right? And you just, like trudging through streams and riding pigs and, playing in the hay lofts and stuff like that.
Annie Mae Pictou grew up hearing horror stories of what had occurred to her people, especially in the residential school right there in her community. As a result, she began thinking about the fight for Indigenous rights early in her life. In 1949, Annie Mae's mother remarried Stephen Noel Sapir, a Mi'kmaq traditionalist who brought stability to the family. He moved them to Pictou Landing, another Mi'kmaq reserve, where he attempted to support the family through seasonal farm work and traditional crafts. Despite their continued financial struggles, this period was significant for Annie Mae as she learned more about her cultural heritage and traditions from her stepdad, which would later influence her activism. Annie Mae's early life was fraught with health challenges due to the poor living conditions on the reserve. She suffered from recurrent eye infections that were eventually diagnosed as tuberculosis, which also affected her lungs. Although she recovered, these illnesses left her physically weakened for some time. In 1956, when Annie Mae was 11 years old, her stepfather died of cancer. This loss marked a turning point in her life as she began attending an off-reserve school where she faced significant racism and bullying. The transition from the reserve school to a more mainstream educational environment was difficult. She encountered academic material that was far advanced compared to what she had previously learned. The racial discrimination she faced at school contributed to a decline in her academic performance. Compounding these difficulties that same year, Annie Mae's mother abandoned the family to remarry on another reserve. This left Annie Mae and her siblings to fend for themselves. Despite these hardships, she managed to stay in school longer than many of her peers, but eventually, the pressure became too much and she dropped out. She began working as a seasonal laborer in potato and berry fields across Maine and the Maritime provinces. Indigenous peoples in North America enjoy a unique right to move freely across the U.S.-Canada border due to historical treaties and legal recognition of their sovereign status. Historical treaties and modern legal frameworks govern Indigenous peoples' movement between the U.S. and Canada, yet it remains a complex issue. The Jay Treaty, signed in 1794 between Great Britain and the United States, grants American Indians born in Canada the right to enter the U.S. for purposes such as travel, study, employment, and retirement. This treaty acknowledges the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to move across borders established long after their ancestral lands were divided by international boundaries. Despite these rights, the practical application of the Jay Treaty is fraught with challenges. The U.S. government requires specific documentation to prove eligibility under the treaty, which can be challenging to obtain. This includes a blood quantum letter from a registered First Nation confirming at least 50%, quote, American Indian ancestry, long-form birth certificates tracing lineage, and a status card. However, obtaining these documents can be lengthy and frustrating for many individuals. In Canada, the Jay Treaty is not recognized as it was deemed void following the War of 1812 and has never been codified in Canadian law. This lack of recognition means that while Indigenous peoples from Canada can freely enter the U.S., those in the U.S. require a passport to cross into Canada. The Canadian government has committed to addressing these border crossing challenges through legislative amendments and policy reforms, but progress has been slow.
So this is one of those moments where I feel Canada just needs to do better, and not in a vague feel-good sense, but a real meaningful way.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that they're obviously being made to jump through hoops, right?
Yeah.
To prove their rights under these treaties and for centuries, and it's absurd, you know. And Canada seems to really drag its feet on these things, overcomplicating things that I think are actually quite easy.
So before there were borders, these nations had their own kind of way of doing things. Yeah.
Don't complicate it. Have your card go. Great. Right?
Yeah. Furthermore, while Indigenous people can cross borders with their goods without duty, according to the Jay Treaty, this provision is not fully honored today. U.S. customs duties still apply, complicating trade and personal transport of goods across the border. Overall, while there are rights in place to facilitate cross-border movement for Indigenous peoples in North America, bureaucratic hurdles and differing national policies continue to pose significant barriers. At 17, in 1962, Annie Mae Pictou moved to Boston with Jake Maloney, a young Mi'kmaq man she knew from school in Shubenacadie, but had yet to date romantically. This move was reportedly on a dare and marked a significant change from the reserve life she was accustomed to. In Boston, Annie Mae found herself in a bustling urban environment that was quite different from her previous experiences. However, the presence of other Mi'kmaq people who had also relocated made the transition somewhat more manageable for her. She began working in a factory and lived with Jake Maloney. They considered themselves married and started a family. In 1964 and 65, Annie Mae gave birth to 2 daughters, Denise and Deborah. After Deborah's birth, she and Jake Maloney married in New Brunswick, but eventually divorced around 1970 after Annie Mae discovered Jake's infidelity. During her time in Boston, Annie Mae became actively involved in the Native American community. She worked with the Boston Indian Council and participated in efforts to support Native Americans struggling with alcoholism. Her activism grew as she became involved with the American Indian movement, AIM, which focused on combating police brutality and advocating for Native American rights. The American Indian movement was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by a group of Native American activists, including Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, Eddie Benton Benai, Pat Belanger, and George Mitchell. The movement emerged from the urban Indian community, significantly affected by U.S. federal policies such as the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. This act encouraged Native Americans to move from reservations to urban areas in search of better economic opportunities, leading to significant displacement and cultural disconnection. Initially, AIM focused on addressing the challenges faced by Native Americans in urban environments, such as high unemployment rates, substandard housing conditions, and racial discrimination. The organization sought to provide aid to those displaced individuals and worked towards economic independence, the revitalization of traditional culture, and the protection of legal rights. Over time, AIM's goals expanded to include broader demands for autonomy over tribal areas and restoring lands believed to have been illegally seized. AIM quickly became known for its activism and direct action tactics. One of its first significant actions was participating in the occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 1971. This protest was organized by several Indian movements and aimed to draw attention to issues affecting Indigenous people in America. Annie's involvement in AIM led her to participate in significant protests and movements such as the Mayflower II Thanksgiving Day protest in 1970. This protest was organized by Wamsutta Frank James and other Indigenous activists in response to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts' invitation for James to speak at a banquet celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival. The organizers expected a speech that would praise the Pilgrims and their legacy, but James' prepared speech was a stark critique of the historical narrative that glorified the settlers while ignoring the suffering and injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. On November 27, 1970, around 200 Indigenous people and supporters gathered on Coles Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts to observe what they declared the first National Day of Mourning. This gathering was a direct challenge to the traditional Thanksgiving narrative. Activists from the American Indian movement, including leaders like Russell Means and Dennis Banks, participated in the protest. They highlighted the deplorable conditions faced by Indigenous Americans, criticized the genocidal actions of the U.S. government, and condemned the romanticized portrayal of Thanksgiving. A vital element of the protest involved a symbolic takeover of the Mayflower II, a replica of the original ship that brought the Pilgrims to America. Protesters boarded the ship, tore down the flag of St. George, and threw overboard a wax statue representing Christopher Jones, the captain of the original Mayflower. These actions were meant to confront and reject the glorification of colonial history. The protesters also disrupted a recreation of the first Thanksgiving dinner by overturning tables and refusing to partake in what they termed the white man's food. This act symbolized their rejection of a narrative that ignored their history and suffering. The event concluded peacefully when the police arrived, with no arrests made. The Mayflower II protest was not just about rejecting Thanksgiving as it was traditionally celebrated, but about asserting Indigenous rights and perspectives. It initiated a broader conversation which continues today about how American history is remembered and taught, challenging people to reconsider whose stories are told and how they're represented.
So this kind of protest is fascinating to me as someone who works in marketing. Like I'm actually looking at it from a PR angle, right?
Sure.
It's steeped in symbolism and iconoclasm, right?
Yeah.
And it's both really incredibly powerful tools for grabbing attention and reframing a narrative. I think that the symbolic takeover of the Mayflower II is genius, right? It's direct, visceral rejection of the colonial myth.
It made people angry, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think, I don't think the whole point of this is to get attention, to draw attention to the issues. These people are not saying, don't celebrate Thanksgiving, right? They're saying, hey, let's pay attention to the truth of history.
Sure.
And I think sort of at a base level, a lot of people think they're trying to take away Thanksgiving. No, people aren't. It's just about getting attention, right? And that first Thanksgiving dinner, it's the kind of bold storytelling that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. And so, from a marketing lens, these acts were deeply intentional because they're using iconic imagery to challenge public perception of history. Right. And it wasn't just a protest. It was branding for a cause. Right. And it worked. It made people talk, think, and question. And that's the kind of impact most campaigns I could only dream of achieving. Right.
Yeah.
And this group were so smart and media savvy.
They
were
really
so media savvy. It's great. Yeah.
Absolutely. In 1972, AIM organized the Trail of Broken Treaties protest, which culminated in the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices in Washington, D.C. This action was part of a more significant demonstration against federal policies and included a 20-point proposal aimed at improving U.S. Indian relations. Throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, AIM utilized media coverage to amplify its message and to bring national attention to Indigenous issues. This strategy helped raise awareness about treaty rights and violations and the need for social justice for Indigenous peoples. AIM's activities during this period laid the groundwork for future Indigenous activism and highlighted the ongoing struggles for sovereignty and rights with Indigenous communities across the United States. Following her separation from Jake Maloney, Annie Mae continued her activism. She made the tough decision to have her daughters move back to Nova Scotia to be raised there by their father and his family. Annie Mae became involved with another activist, Shubenacadie Aquash, a key figure within AIM. Shubenacadie was an Ojibwe activist from Ontario who shared Annie Mae's commitment to Indigenous issues. Together, they became deeply involved in the movement's efforts to address systemic injustices faced by Indigenous people. Their partnership symbolized the broader collaboration among activists from various tribes and backgrounds within AIM. Perhaps the most significant protest in the early 70s in which both Annie and Nagishik were involved was the occupation at Wounded Knee, a settlement on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The events there, and those subsequent, ultimately led to the death of Annie Mae. More after a quick break. And we are back. Matthew, thoughts so far?
What's interesting is, if you look at it, AIM wasn't asking for much, really.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was not going to hugely disrupt American way of life for the economy or national security, right? It was about trying to get the government to do what it said it was going to do through treaties.
Mm-hmm.
And if you honestly stop and think about Indigenous rights and what's being asked, it's not this big scary thing, right?
Right.
It's about being fair and making some amends. And when people are ignored and treaties are trashed so freely, the tensions will rise, right? And they always have and they always will. No matter the race, the background, the country, this is all over the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we end up shooting each other. And we end up shooting each other way too quickly and easily.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
it seems like, I don't know.
It's just why can't people just be more diplomatic and figure shit out,
Yeah, the world has lost its ability to see gray, there's a lot of black and white stuff going on right now. And it doesn't matter where you land on the spectrum of politics or whatever. There's a lot of division. People on one side, quote unquote, hate the others on the other side. And it's well, how is anything ever going to get fixed if we're just busy hating?
It never will. But and the other point here is, in terms of Indigenous rights, is I think in North America we have a very we don't know what history is,
mm-hmm.
right? So when I was in London, I used to go to a pub that was older than Canada,
right? Yeah,
right. So
yep.
So this all of this stuff that happened a few hundred years ago in human history, when colonials first came over, that's actually really recent. If you think about it,
it's a blink, yeah,
right.
Mm-hmm.
So people go, oh, why can't people just leave it alone, right? Well, it's actually fresh. It's fresh.
Yeah, it's only a few generations, really.
It's fresh, right?
Yeah. In February 1973, AIM activists, including Annie Mae and Nagishik, responded to calls from the Pine Ridge Reservation community to address local grievances against the tribal leadership and federal policies. The occupation of Wounded Knee was intended as a peaceful protest but quickly escalated into a standoff with federal authorities. The site was chosen for its symbolic significance as the location of the 1890 massacre of the Lakota Sioux by U.S. troops. Annie Mae's involvement at Wounded Knee was characterized by her dedication to the cause and her role as a medic during the occupation. Annie Mae Pictou and Nagishik Aquash were married in a traditional Lakota ceremony during the Wounded Knee occupation. The 2-month occupation drew national attention on the plight of Native Americans, marking a pivotal moment in Indigenous activism in the United States. During the standoff, 2 Indigenous men, Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Buddy Lamonte, were killed and several others were wounded during several exchanges of gunfire between the Indigenous protesters and government forces. The conflict also resulted in injuries among the federal forces, including U.S. Marshal Lloyd Grimm, who was seriously injured, as well as 2 FBI agents who were shot and wounded on April 27th. The standoff ended on May 8, 1973, after 71 days. It concluded with AIM members surrendering and evacuating Wounded Knee in exchange for a promise of negotiations with the federal government. The disengagement agreement was reached after prolonged negotiations and increasing pressure from federal authorities. Significant legal and social repercussions came in the aftermath of the standoff. Over 1,200 arrests were made concerning the occupation, leading to 275 cases in federal, state, and tribal courts. AIM members such as Russell Means, Clyde Bellecourt, and Dennis Banks faced multiple criminal charges. Despite the legal challenges faced by AIM members, the occupation succeeded in bringing international attention to Indigenous issues and prompted discussions about Indigenous rights and treaty obligations. The occupation also influenced subsequent law enforcement practices. For instance, it prompted the development of SWAT teams at the FBI Academy to handle similar situations in the future. Additionally, AIM received support from various activists and public figures, which helped them to sustain momentum for Indigenous rights movements beyond Wounded Knee. The standoff was a pivotal event in the history of Indigenous activism in America, marking a significant moment in the struggle for Indigenous rights. The defendants in the Wounded Knee trials found themselves pitted against the U.S. government, a daunting adversary. Fortunately for the American Indian movement, its leaders had high profiles and influential connections. Dennis Banks, a central figure in AIM, counted Hollywood elites like Marlon Brando among his friends, leveraging their support to generate public sympathy and raise critical funds in the movement. The trials themselves revealed shocking details about government surveillance when a judge ordered the FBI to disclose their Wounded Knee files. The courtroom was astounded to learn that the Bureau had now compiled an astonishing 315,000 file classifications related to AIM. However, the methods behind this vast information collection remained shrouded in secrecy, including the infiltration of AIM by federal informants. One such informant, Douglas Durham, gained entry into Wounded Knee with fabricated press credentials and ultimately became a close confidant of Dennis Banks, earning a position as his right-hand man, and secretly worked against AIM for 2 years from the inside.
I just don't understand why there's this huge concern by the government, why so many resources are being put into this.
Well, at the time, I think it was Nixon.
Yeah, oh God, there we go. Sorry, I didn't put it into the perspective of, okay, solved, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was anything that was a threat. Oh, LSD makes people think. Let's quash it.
Nixon was a total racist.
Oh, yeah.
And if anyone disagrees with me, I'll pull up the speeches, okay?
Yeah, pull up the tapes that were made in the White House of him. Oh my goodness gracious.
Honestly, do you think this much resource versus actually just sitting down at a table and figuring stuff out, right? Doesn't that just seem like an easier way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that no one on the governmental side was willing to sit down and have a listen is what creates the rebellion.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. During this period, Annie Mae Aquash began to stand out in AIM. Despite her dedication to the cause, Aquash's relationship with AIM became increasingly fraught. She became known for her strong stance against the male-dominated hierarchy within AIM and her willingness to challenge its leaders. Amid the turmoil after Wounded Knee, AIM members Annie Mae and Negeshik managed to avoid severe legal repercussions. The newly married pair sought stability, briefly settling in Boston and Canada before feeling an inevitable pull back to South Dakota and the AIM movement. Their relationship, marked by moments of levity and humor, also carried profound challenges. Annie Mae, known for her stoicism, never spoke ill of Negeshik, even when their personal struggles became evident. Friends recalled instances of conflict, such as an occasion where she silently endured his drunken aggression during a gathering. Despite her efforts, their relationship eventually disintegrated. Annie Mae quit drinking and threw herself into the movement, channeling her energy into education and activism. Teaching at AIM's Little Red Schoolhouse in St. Paul, she envisioned one day returning to Nova Scotia to establish her own school. Her dedication resonated deeply as many admired her sacrifices, leaving behind her young children and homeland to uplift Indigenous communities in the United States. Annie Mae's commitment extended beyond her teaching role. She became a guiding force for younger AIM members, particularly the women, holding them to high standards during turbulent times. She expressed frustration with the celebratory excesses that followed the Wounded Knee trials and subsequent acquittals, behaviors she saw as distracting from the movement's greater mission. Her disapproval made her withdraw periodically, creating a distance that underscored her focus on discipline and purpose. After briefly visiting Nova Scotia to see her daughters, Annie Mae returned to the U.S. to work with AIM in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Her activities within the movement led her into an affair with one of its leaders, Dennis Banks, who was married to a friend of Annie's at the time. In 1975, Annie Mae Aquash joined Dennis Banks and other activists in Gresham, Wisconsin, where the Menominee Warrior Society had occupied an abandoned Catholic abbey. This occupation, also marked by tension and gunfire, lasted over a month. Among the protesters was actor Marlon Brando, who came to show solidarity with the American Indian movement. The situation was chaotic and dangerous. Protesters had to sneak into the novitiate under fire, with Annie Mae and others running through the woods to evade conflict. The experience left a lasting impression on those who participated.
An abandoned abbey. Occupation of an abandoned building.
Yeah.
Why the gunfire?
That's a great question.
Literally, oh, great. Okay, you're in an abandoned building. Have fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like, make the statement, but no, guns have to come out of blazing because, oh my God, that's about them not wanting to have them make a statement.
The same thing happened in Waco.
There were no hostages, right? It wasn't a building that's a working building. That they are just literally coming in because they don't want the statement made.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sorry, I'm getting riled up, Mike.
Well, that's why we're doing this episode.
To rile Matthew up.
No, well, I mean...
You secretly like that.
Partially. Partially that's why. But no, this is exactly why I want to do this show. I want to make people talk and make people think. After the Gresham occupation, Annie Mae was sent to California, where she played a pivotal role in reorganizing AIM's Los Angeles chapter. She was an effective fundraiser and rose to prominence within the organization. However, suspicions grew about Doug Durham, a fellow AIM member with conspicuous resources, who many, including Annie Mae, suspected was an FBI informant. These suspicions were confirmed in March 1975 when Durham admitted publicly that he had infiltrated AIM at its highest levels as a paid FBI operative. His revelation fueled widespread paranoia within the movement, with accusations of informants spreading like wildfire. In Los Angeles, Annie Mae became close to other AIM members, though she remained secretive and cautious. She only spoke freely during walks along the ocean, wary of being overheard. During this time, she revealed her real name, as many had known her by the alias Joanne Jason. She confided her concerns about uranium mining on native land, hinting at her involvement in efforts to protect reservations from exploitations by energy companies and government agencies. Uranium, then seen as the, quote, new gold, was highly lucrative, and leases on treaty land were quietly granted to energy consortiums, often at significant cost to Indigenous communities. Annie Mae's concerns reflected a larger struggle as Indigenous activists faced growing threats from both corporate interests and federal authorities. The illegal activities of the FBI in monitoring and undermining AIM further deepened the mistrust within the movement, leaving Annie Mae and others to navigate an increasingly fraught and dangerous environment. The male leadership of AIM resented Annie Mae's growing influence within the movement, and rumors started to swirl that Annie Mae might be an FBI informant. Some of the women thought so too. In the spring of 1975, during a national conference of the American Indian movement, Annie Mae was pulled aside by AIM leadership and subjected to an intense interrogation. Her interrogators questioned her identity and loyalty, accusing her of being an informer. a claim she vehemently denied. Reflecting on the experience later, a close confidant described the encounter as terrifying. Years later, Iris Thundercloud, who the same group had also interrogated then, revealed harrowing details. Thundercloud disclosed that during her interrogation, a gun was forced into her mouth before she managed to convince her accusers of her loyalty.
Yeah, and here you go. This is exactly what the FBI wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Sow division from within.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
It's so bad when people start turning on their own. And, all of this and what's to come in the rest of the story was so unnecessary. But this is the FBI. This is the FBI doing this stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting how, everybody played their own part. There were people who were afraid, and fear seemed to be the big motivator on both sides of this kind of thing. The people within the organization were terrified. The leadership within the organization is terrified that they're going to lose power, and the FBI is trying to gain power. It's interesting. It's an interesting.
It's just so senseless, though.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I sound hippy dippy, but I'm like,
you are not a hippie.
I'm like, just talk it through.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to stop.
By this time, Annie Mae had returned to Pine Ridge. The reservation was still in chaos, gripped by a violent conflict between AIM supporters, local government-backed goon squads, and covert FBI operations. The violence escalated into what some described as wholesale terrorism, with bodies being found and drive-by shootings becoming common. The conflict was fueled by divisions between traditionalist Indigenous Americans and mixed-blood supporters of the reservation's controversial chairman, Dick Wilson. Amid this turmoil, Annie Mae emerged as a fearless organizer whose work unsettled the FBI and local opposition forces. The conflict came to a head on June 25, 1975 at the Jumping Bull compound, where a deadly shootout occurred between AIM members and the FBI. 2 FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams, were killed, and Joe Stuntz, a young Native man, was shot dead in the aftermath. The FBI quickly descended on the area, initiating a massive search operation. Helicopters scoured the countryside and agents restricted access to the land for days. Annie Mae, though out of state during the shootout, joined the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Committee, aiding local residents in understanding their rights and resisting FBI intimidation. By the late summer of 1975, AIM was fracturing under the weight of paranoia and internal power struggles. The annual Sundance at Crow Dog's Paradise became a focal point in FBI surveillance, with agents closely monitoring attendees. Although Annie Mae was not present during the shootout, she, like many AIM leaders, became a target of the FBI's relentless investigation. The FBI had been closely monitoring Annie Mae, and in the fall of 1975 their attention turned to an RV near Portland, Oregon, owned by Marlon Brando, which they suspected of transporting weapons and individuals connected to the murders of FBI agents. Annie Mae was in the vehicle then, along with Dennis Banks, Leonard Peltier, Dennis's pregnant wife Kamuk, and 2 young children. When law enforcement stopped the mobile home, Banks and Peltier fled, leaving the others behind. Annie Mae was arrested and interrogated in Oregon, where agents referred to Informant A and Informant B, whose tips had led to the incident. Determined to uncover the identities of these informants, Annie Mae wrote a letter to her family from jail in Vancouver, Washington. In her letter, she expressed her pride in her Mi'kmaq heritage and her unwavering commitment to Indigenous rights, even in the face of escalating government opposition. She mentioned that she would return to South Dakota soon, where her legal troubles awaited, and signed off with love and hope. This would be the last communication Annie Mae had with her family. On November 23, 1975, she was transported back to South Dakota and released on bond. Scheduled to face weapons charges the following day, she failed to appear in court, effectively becoming a fugitive. Christmas came and went without any contact from her, leaving her daughters anxiously awaiting news. On February 24, 1976, a woman's body was discovered on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Officers from 3 agencies, including the FBI, arrived at the scene. Despite her prominence as a known activist, no one identified the body. An autopsy conducted by Dr. W.O. Brown revealed no significant trauma beyond a small cut on her head, and exposure was listed as the cause of death. In a grim and invasive act, Dr. Brown was instructed by FBI agents to sever the woman's hands at the wrists for fingerprint analysis, which were sent to a lab out of state for identification.
Okay, I'm going to use the old trope, but this is an example of, if this was a white blonde woman, do you think they would have been severing hands off of the corpse?
Absolutely not.
That just shows complete disdain or feeling that somebody else, another race, is worthless or something. Not giving the respect to somebody because of their race.
Yeah.
It's horrible. Like, at first I wrote why in the notes here. Like, why would they do that? Then I just was like, I just think I answered my own question. They just didn't give a shit because of who she was.
There's a word in German, I don't know if you've heard it before, it's Untermensch, and essentially it means a person considered racially or socially inferior. Imagine
if somebody you love body is found. And they're like, oh, we need fingerprints. And your sister, my brother, right? Sewed off their hands. And then you find that out later. Like, how absolutely mortified and livid would you be that happened?
I would be very.
And don't you think that her family felt that way? So anyone who's listening,
they did feel that way, just so you know, because I've read.
Absolutely. And so just put yourself in the shoes. Go, if that was your loved one got killed somewhere and they did that to their body, what would that say to you of what they thought of your family? Right? Yeah. Annie, sorry. I'm just,
Why are you apologizing? That's why you're here.
I get so upset. These ones get me so upset.
Even before she was identified, the body was quietly buried near Pine Ridge. Days later, the FBI identified the person as Annie Mae Aquash by way of her fingerprints and notified her family. As we mentioned, they initially claimed she'd died of exposure, but her family questioned this explanation, suspecting she must have been injured. Breaking the devastating news to her children, her loved ones described her as a warrior who died in a, quote, Indian war. On March 8th, 1976, Annie Mae's family requested an exhumation and a second autopsy. The independent pathologist quickly uncovered a bullet wound in the back of Annie Mae's head, confirming she'd been murdered. She'd been slain by a .32 caliber pistol. Rumors swirled that members of the American Indian movement suspected Annie Mae of being an FBI informant, a belief that sowed distrust even among her allies. So pervasive was this accusation that AIM members refused to dig her grave. Instead, 5 women braving cold and frozen ground completed the task themselves. Her funeral brought no peace to her family, leaving lingering feelings of unease. Theories about Annie Mae's death abounded, with many suspecting FBI involvement, while whispers within AIM hinted at internal betrayal. Eventually, Annie Mae's body was taken back to Nova Scotia for burial near family. Despite decades of investigation, including 3 grand juries and testimony from hundreds of witnesses, no one was charged. The case became one of many unsolved murders on the Pine Ridge Reservation, with Annie Mae reduced to, quote, just another dead Indian, end quote, in the eyes of authorities. Annie Mae's daughters grew up in silence about the particulars of their mother's death, sensing the weight of unspoken truths. Only as adults did they begin to question the events surrounding her murder. Rumors of her interrogation, kidnapping, and execution by AIM members were widely known, yet shrouded in secrecy. Those knowing her fate either denied involvement or urged others to lie. The search for justice went on for decades. The investigation into Annie Mae's death was complex and prolonged, involving multiple suspects. Finally, in March 2003, AIM members Arlo Lookingcloud and John Graham were finally indicted for her murder. Lookingcloud, an Oglala Lakota, was convicted in 2004 and sentenced to life imprisonment. His conviction was based on testimonies from various witnesses, including his adopted brother Richard Two Elk and former AIM chairman John Trudell, who testified that Looking Cloud had confessed to them before any indictments or arrests were made. John Graham, also known as Johnny Boy Patton, a southern Tachoni Athabascan from Canada, faced a separate trial. He was extradited to the United States in 2007 and convicted in 2010 for his role in Annie Mae's murder. Graham was accused of being the one who'd shot Annie Mae in the back of the head. Another key figure in the case was Thelma Rios, a Lakota advocate who was charged alongside Graham for kidnapping Annie Mae Aquash. In 2010, she pleaded guilty to being an accessory to kidnapping and received a suspended sentence due to her poor health. Rios admitted in court that she had relayed messages from AIM leadership to other members about bringing Annie Mae from Denver to Rapid City because they suspected her of being an FBI informant. Despite these convictions, many supporters of Annie Mae Aquash believe that higher-level AIM officials were involved in ordering her murder due to fears that she was an informant. This case remains significant in Indigenous activism history, highlighting the internal tensions within AIM and the broader struggles for Indigenous rights during that era.
The FBI won. The government won.
Mm-hmm.
They sowed the seeds of doubt. They stirred up conflict. They won. They destroyed them from the inside.
Yeah, terrible. In March 2018, Denise Pictou Maloney provided testimony to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls regarding her mother, Annie Mae Pictou Aquash. Her account shed light on the tragic circumstances surrounding her mother's death and the subsequent quest for justice. Denise recounted her interactions with individuals connected to her mother's case, including Leonard Peltier, later convicted of shooting the two FBI agents, who also admitted to interrogating Annie Mae, though he denied doing so at gunpoint. The testimony also highlighted the political complexities surrounding the case. Denise expressed shock at the Assembly of First Nations resolution supporting Leonard Peltier, whom she described as, quote, a convicted felon sitting in prison for 2 life sentences for murdering 2 human beings, end quote. Denise Pictou Maloney provided disturbing details about her mother's treatment before her death, heard at subsequent legal proceedings against Annie's killers. Denise stated, quote, we got to hear again all of the testimony that supported and substantiated the facts that they kidnapped her, that members within the American Indian movement kidnapped her, interrogated her, beat her, end quote. She also mentioned a particularly chilling detail, quote, when they took her to her house, they made her cut the labels out of her clothes and change her clothes, end quote. Denise speculated on the reasons for this action, suggesting it might have been for psychological torture or to eliminate evidence of beatings. It may have been to hide her identity. Denise described how her mother was kidnapped from her house in Denver, Colorado, then driven to Rapid City, South Dakota, where she was interrogated, beaten, and raped. The testimony concluded with the heartbreaking final moments of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash's life. Quote, and while she knelt praying for us, John Graham shot her in the back of the head. End quote. Telling Annie's story is crucial not only to honor her legacy as a courageous advocate, but also to acknowledge the injustices Indigenous women face and inspire future generations to continue the fight for equality and recognition. Annie Mae was every inch a warrior. And that's it for Dark Poutine episode 346, Complex Justice, the tragic story of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash.
That's right. It's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week.
All right, here is our first voicemail.
Hi, Mike, Matthew, and Steve. This is Charlene, and I'm calling from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I started listening to your podcast when I started a new job 2 years ago, and It was actually the very first podcast that I chose to listen to and is still my favorite. You guys make my Monday. I had a thought for a suggestion for a show because I don't think I've heard you guys do it, but the Springfield mining disaster seems like it could be interesting to listen to. I loved your Halifax explosion one that you guys did a while back. But yeah, I love hearing you guys. You make Mondays better. Go take a shit in your hat. Bye.
Well, thank you so much. So I do have a couple of books on the Spring Hill mining disaster, and it is on the list and probably going to get written over the Christmas holidays.
Cool.
So, yeah.
So Charlene, she's over there.
In Halifax.
Yeah, aerospace engineer.
Really?
Yeah.
There is some aerospace companies in Nova Scotia. There's a number
there
of
you
them.
go. Well, she's an aerospace engineer.
There you go.
Yeah.
Is there a particular focus that she has, or?
Yeah, she's going to be the first. She's doing it for herself. She's going to be the first human on Mars.
Well, there you go. Apparently, it's bad for your kidneys to travel through space for a long time, so we need to figure a way to do it faster.
Just for the kidneys? Why the kidneys?
I'm not sure. I don't know the science, but just briefly, I read something about kidneys. Anyway.
Hi, Mike and Matthew. This is Leslie. My timer just went off. This is Leslie. I am in Springfield, Oregon, and I listen to you all the time. And I have an idea on why pork is more expensive than chicken. So I have pondered this as well. My husband's idea, I think, is right. His idea is because of bird flu and all the flocks that have to be destroyed because, so they're not in the food chain. So that is my idea on why pork is less expensive than chicken because of the bird flu. Have a great day. Bye.
So pork is more expensive than chicken because of the bird flu. Interesting.
That probably could have something to do with it.
It could play into it,
right?
I don't know.
I'm thinking maybe it's supply and demand as well. Like maybe more people eat chicken than pork, so they know they can put the price up, right?
Yep, fair enough. Yeah,
but Leslie,
it's probably a simple answer like that.
Leslie is 100% a chef. That's why her timer went off, and that's why she's digging into pork versus chicken cost.
I gotcha. Yeah. Well, there you go. That makes sense.
Chef. Yeah.
Well, the world needs more chefs because I'm definitely not one.
Good.
You're more of one than I am, for sure.
I am. I'm a good cook, but I love good food, and in fact, my husband and I are going out to Rodney's Oyster Bar today to celebrate his 5-year anniversary of being a Canadian citizen.
That's very great. And tell him congratulations from me.
Thank you.
Much appreciated that he brought you here.
He joined the team?
That he joined the team, anyway.
Hey, my name is Jamie, and I am from Sparwood, BC, better known for the big green truck. Just calling to say that I've been listening to you guys like weekly. Well, since I learned who you were, I went and binged beforehand, but I was calling to say that I think you guys are amazing, and Mike, you're awesome. Matthew, you make me laugh all the time. I am Indigenous from the Shubenacadie Nation, and I'm proudly living on the Shubenacadie Nation land. I think that you should look into or cover the story on my cousin Christian, a young man. He was shot in Strathmore, Alberta, or also my uncle who went missing in Kamloops, BC, which is more familiar with you. He went missing near or by the Thompson River. But anyway, I hope you guys have a great day and take a poop in your toque. Cheers.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, Jamie, if you wouldn't mind emailing me, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com, with a little more information. I couldn't quite make out the last name of your relative who was murdered, so I would love to talk more about that with you. So, just email me. It would be fantastic.
Should I give Jamie a job?
I think I know what her job is.
Oh, what is it?
She maintains that really big truck.
I was gonna say she trains people in what's that called when you do ballet on ice?
Ice capades?
No, just sort of the Olympics, like
the Olympics. Oh, ice dance.
Well, what? No, it's not called ice dance. What's it
Figure
called?
skating.
Figure skating. Ballet on ice.
Well, there is ice dance. My cousin Rob won a bronze medal in Calgary for ice dance.
How did I forget the word figure skating?
I don't know.
Well, anyway, Jamie is a world-class figure skater and is training future Olympians.
And to make ends meet, she works on the world's largest tandem axle truck.
Maybe the skating rink's in the back of the truck.
It's a 1974 Terex Titan. And it was the world's largest truck for 25 years. Wow. 3,300 horsepower. The diesel engine is 10,343 cubic inches. Holy smokes, that's a big engine. Anyway, thank you, Jamie. And yes, please email me and we will chat more about that. That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. Alrighty, so here we go. We have no patrons this week, but we do have a donut money donor, and that person is Alana Miller, and Alana lives in Toronto, and she says, one day I will leave a voicemail about my husband's reaction to the Big Apple in Colborne and apple picking traditions in Ontario. He's from Mexico and was fascinated by our apple culture. Oh, that's interesting. I would like to hear his take on that, actually.
I guess we kind of do. There is an apple culture in places. It's part of Ontario and in the Okanagan as well.
And also the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia is we used to have an apple blossom festival, and there's a big apple in Berwick, as you say.
Berwick.
Whatever, it's Berwick. That's what we call it. Anyway,
I think Alana is a human rights lawyer.
A human rights lawyer. Wow.
Yeah, I'm gonna give her a cool job because she's talking apples.
She's talking apples, so she needs a cool job.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. I need to get to Toronto. A bunch of the folks from Traders are getting together.
Oh no.
I can't go because I've had to save my shekels for going back to Nova Scotia for Christmas. Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. And that's it for this episode of Dark Poutine. So until next time, don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple.
Talk, people. Talk. Don't fight.
Yeah, don't fight. Talk. Let's talk.
Coffee talk.